Welcome to our Monday morning podcast and audiogram, coming to you from Walnut Hill Church in Lexington, Kentucky. Each week, we invite you to join our conversation as we revisit Sunday's sermon and share a few extra insights along the way. This week, we're looking at the Annunciation and how Mary embraced Gabriel's message, stepping faithfully into a complicated calling to help fulfill God's promise of a Savior. Good morning to everyone out there. We're trying something different today.
How does it feel so far?
More difficult than I thought, to be honest. I have to give you credit. I'm doing the lead-in today, as people can hear, from Walnut Hill. No longer the Monday morning quarterback is
Sadly.
established. Well, I hope it's not because I added a feminine touch and now we need an anti-football.
No, that's a
Yeah.
very sexist thing to say. Why would football be anti-feminine? Do feminine folks not like football?
No, that's true. And given that I have engaged in football games myself,
You mean when you say you engaged in a game, did you play the game or did you just sort of emotionally engage in it?
I played the game.
Okay.
I almost got an interception, at least a block. I think my dad was more proud of me then than ever for the 4.0s I got.
That is hilarious. Well, you're doing a wonderful job, Jesse. Thanks for leading us there.
Yeah. So we're going to do our thing, our podcast from Walnut Hill. And we were just talking about podcasts. It's interesting because usually I always think of them as purely a radio type broadcast, but now you do have videos more often.
Yeah. What do you prefer? As you consume a podcast, which communicates most effectively to you?
Well, I listen to them in the car.
Yeah.
So I think for me, I don't need the visual, but apparently people do really. You said AJ likes this.
She does. She watches them on TV. When I get home, she's almost always got a podcast going. And I've heard some feedback that folks miss the video aspect of our Monday mornings, but it's easier not to be on video.
Yeah.
And certainly it's easier on those who are watching for me not to be on video.
It's easier for me too because I don't have to think about controlling my facial expressions, which can
Right.
be quite expressive.
You are. And for me, it's also posture. I mean, I'm kind of kicked back right now. It's just so much easier.
Right. It is easier to relax.
But it is, now what's the date today? It is the 8th of
The
December?
8th, yes, we're
believe that.
already into December. We had such a great weekend here
We
at
did, didn't
Walnut Hill. We had a garland party, 200 Feet project, where we gathered socks for some local organizations. And man, we had a crowd.
We did. It was a wonderful week.
And then the potluck yesterday was great too. So I hope people will join us for our next weekend when we have our Christmas pageant.
too.
And even if you aren't here, you can see it online.
I know. So no sermon for me this week.
I know. How do you feel about that?
I don't mind a break, although I love preaching in Advent because there tend to be more people coming into worship. And you never know if you have that opportunity just to touch someone who's maybe either never heard the gospel or is just in a moment in their life where they're feeling sort of an emptiness or a yearning or there's a hunger there.
Right.
And I always hate to miss that opportunity, but I'm going to trust that as our children convey the gospel story, that they'll do the same thing.
I think they do. You know,
They do.
there's not a whole lot better than a bunch of kids singing Go Tell It on the Mountain.
There really isn't.
It's hard to outdo that.
Sort of half singing, half yelling is what they do, isn't it?
That's called enthusiasm,
That is. That's
I
right.
think, for a 6-year-old. So how do you feel the sermon went yesterday?
If you haven't yet watched our worship and worshiped with us, if you'll go to our Facebook page or our church website, you can see that service and then rejoin this podcast. If you were here or saw us online, you know that we're in Luke chapter 1. We started with verse 26. I felt okay. It was one of those deals where, and I always feel like when I don't like the sermon I preach, I have to find an excuse. Like it can't be me. You know, there has to be some external factor. And so here's my external factor for yesterday. I didn't feel great about the message, primarily because I was tired because our heat went out and it was really, really cold.
This is bad
Sorry.
timing.
It was bad timing. Why would our heat go out at midnight on a Saturday?
Right. In the middle of winter.
In the middle of winter, of course. And so, you know, I didn't sleep well, woke up, and I just was in one of those funks yesterday. I mean, you know, it's not an AI-generated voice up there. I mean, it's a human
No.
preaching.
But were you in a funk or were you just experiencing an anhedonia?
And well, that's a great question. So you were listening, weren't you?
I was listening.
You were on the front row, by the way.
I was.
You and my wife. Anhedonia is the inability to experience pleasure. No, I wasn't experiencing that,
Mm.
but I think what I was experiencing was just that kind of counterbalance that you have to have between dopamine and the highs of all that and just life being sometimes difficult and challenging. And you've got to have both. And what I wanted to say yesterday, I didn't quite fully communicate was in order to really not have anhedonia and to enjoy the good times, there has to be that counterbalance of there's going to be some bad times and tough times and challenging times, difficult, complex, complicated. It's just the way it goes. And the point that I was trying to make yesterday was, according to Dr. Anna Lemke, and we just looked up her podcast, 2 hours and 18 minutes. I knew it was a long one because I took an
Yeah, there's
afternoon.
several ones to choose from. Diary of a CEO. I
Yep.
think Rick Roll, Joe Rogan too.
She's
Quite a few.
prolific and she's wonderful. But she's concerned that we've become a nation of dopamine addicts and that because of this, we have to push more and more to experience this dopamine rush. And we're becoming desensitized. Those neural pathways are becoming desensitized. And so what I wanted to do yesterday was kind of take that and think about how Mary's life was so complicated, and it was okay. She was faithful in the midst of all that, and God blessed her and used her. She became God's instrument rather than saying, this is too difficult, this is too much, it's too complex, way too complicated for me. She was like, may it be as you have said, and I'm your servant. Let me be your instrument. And I just wanted to think with our congregation about when we find that life is complicated, what does it look like just to open ourselves and say, God, I'm your instrument in this complex situation.
I was thinking about that, and I was wondering, how Mary was able to be that open, and does it have something to do with her youthfulness?
I wondered about that too, because put it this way, when I was 15, I was much more curious and filled with wonder than I am, 40 plus years later.
Right, and more accepting, I
Yeah.
think, of
Mhm.
new and different things and experiences. But it's amazing when you think about a 13 to 14-year-old girl and the responsibility she had on her shoulders.
And the courage she had. Now, of course, if you have been visited by an angel who's been in the presence of God, hopefully that's going to eventually give you confidence. Like, this is the real thing here. I'm going to believe this and go with it. Although Zechariah, he didn't have the same response. He was a priest. You'd think he would be just right there. Hey, Gabriel says Elizabeth's going to have a child, and Zechariah's like, I don't believe you.
But I almost think that's where her innocence pays off.
Yeah.
Right. I think Zechariah, you suggested this in your sermon, might have felt like he had the answers being a priest and being educated. I don't know how much Mary was educated, but certainly just having that openness.
Mm-hmm. So when was the last time you were really surprised by something when you thought you knew the answers and you learned otherwise and that you were surprised? This is something new for me.
I mean, every day, Sean, I have a 6-year-old who is constantly,
Uh-huh.
quote unquote, teaching me things.
What do you say? Does she literally say that to you?
She thinks she is. Yes,
Oh my
absolutely.
gosh.
So, for instance, last week, this is just a funny story. I went to the classroom to read her class books, and I found out that, in fact, I was not reading books. My child was going to read the book and act it out, and I was merely sitting there next to her. So that was a surprise.
That is a surprise.
But it was very entertaining.
And she did it.
Oh, absolutely.
How did the students react to this?
You know what? In that typical Lily way, she seemed to have a handle on it, and they seemed to just go with it.
My gosh, that's great.
It was hilarious.
Yeah. But one of the things that we talked about yesterday was about being surprised is I do think for me, my formal education was wasted on my youth. And I don't want to say wasted. It had value and I learned a ton, but I really was not as curious as I was eager just to get through it and just to kind of get through these courses. And I knew needed to make all A's my last couple years of undergrad. And so that's all I cared about. I have good short-term memory, just memorized for the purpose of testing. And now, 40 years later, I learn for entertainment.
Right.
My entertainment is to learn something new.
I do the same thing. Podcasts are on in my house all the time.
Yep. And so, again, I don't know if this kind of reinforces our thoughts about Zechariah or not, but certainly it didn't seem like he was in a place in his life where he was willing to learn something new. And so we have this angel Gabriel, and I haven't heard any feedback. Was it interesting to you or inspiring to you to think about Gabriel being with the prophet Daniel and saying, hey, this is what's going to happen 7 times 70 years from now? And then here he is back on the scene to the very year, showing up with Zechariah and then later with Mary.
I think it has to be meaningful. I mean, as a prophecy, right?
Mhm.
So you're seeing God's word fulfilled, and
Mhm.
throughout the Bible, there's so many times He promises and then delivers. So I think it's incredibly important.
Yeah, for me, it's interesting. And also, one of the things that I really want to communicate whenever we open scripture is that God has this story that God is writing, and he's the only author. And so God knows, he knows where it's going. And that just stirs my faith and my trust. And so then we learned about Mary being pledged.
Yes.
So there's a difference, engaged, you go to Lily's school, say, I like this family. Let's see if we can get these two married in 10 years. And that's kind of that. I mean, that was sort of what they did. They arranged for these marriages as young as age 2, being pledged. They were not yet living together. They were legally married, but they had not yet consummated their marriage. And then to be married formally, now they've consummated the marriage. They're living under the same roof. I don't hear it as much as I used to, but the concept of Mary being a virgin was really problematic for a number of folks that I've had in my life over the years. And so process that with me, if you would. When you hear that, or what do you think?
I guess for me, it's not that surprising. If you think about all of the miracles Jesus
Hmm.
made happen, why wouldn't that be possible for his
Hmm.
birth?
Right.
It seems to make sense
It
to
does
me,
to me.
honestly.
Same here. I mean, so we had a class yesterday, and I had 4 teenagers, 4 students in there, and we were talking about this very thing, Jesus being fully God and fully human. And one of the students basically said, well, he had to be born of a virgin because he was fully God. He couldn't have 2 human parents. And so that was that rationale that student had, which I thought was an interesting insight.
No, it is. It kind of harkens back to Greek and Roman mythology, right? With Hercules, how he was half god and
Yeah.
half human.
And then, of course, and that was to fulfill a prophecy, Isaiah 7, verse 14, the virgin will conceive.
The
And what about the whole the virgin, the Ohio State University?
The Ohio State University, I am very familiar with, having lived in Cincinnati for quite a while. It was a pretty funny
Yeah,
origin.
they knew. I mean, our congregation knew the Ohio State. And then we talked about the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek about 250 years before the birth of Christ, called the Septuagint or Septuagint, however you want to pronounce that. And in that translation, the scholars determined that the word was virgin, not young woman.
But what I thought was interesting too is you brought up in the sermon when you were talking about that, the NIV versus different versions
Mhm.
of the Bible. And you said you had a favorite. Can you remind us?
I like the NIV. In
Okay.
fact, that's what I have open here. It's more conversational for me, and yet it's not a paraphrase, it's a translation. A paraphrase would be like the Living Bible or the Message or the Good News Bible. Those are more paraphrases. It's a translation from the Greek and the Hebrew, but it reads easier for me. I've never been able to read the King James. The New King James is difficult for me. And then I think the NRSV, which is what we have in our pews here at Walnut Hill Church, I think there was a real effort to make the language inclusive language and to eliminate a lot of the use of pronouns. And while that's accurate, it's clunky for me to read and to study that. So I just like the NIV.
Now, I am asking you kind of a pointed question, but
Okay.
are there any versions that you think have drifted too far away from the original meaning? Because I feel like every time you have a translation, you get a little further away from the original.
Right. I have never read one that I felt like was misleading me, where there were important texts that were omitted or that they were altered. I really haven't encountered that. Like I said, the King James Version for me is just difficult. And there are some who don't really care for the King James Version. I'm fine with it. I cut my teeth on the RSV, the Revised Standard Version, and then the NRSV, which I can't even tell you when that came along, maybe 20 years ago, 25, 30 years ago, seemed to really be interested in, again, cleaning up the language so that it was not so gender specific to the masculine. And so that's been my read on it. But yeah, interesting question.
Well,
We're going all over the place, aren't we?
interesting with translations and how they're updated to meet the
Mhm.
vernacular.
So rather than just go through the passage again, anything as we went through the text that you thought, hey, let's talk about that today? And the next one we talked about was the angel Gabriel appearing to Mary.
What I liked is the overall message was look at your life and see how you can be an instrument of God. And how you do that is looking to see what the needs are and how those needs meet your interest. And so, one thing I wanted to ask is what signs did you see that you should go into ministry?
Boy, that's a long time ago. And long answer. First of all, I felt an inclination toward it. I felt this natural kind of um, pull by the Spirit to that. And I felt like it was something I was gifted in. So I started looking at what my passions were. And I always loved leadership. Throughout my young life, I was always a leader. In almost every organization I was in, somehow found myself in charge, or at least right there in leadership. And so I was sort of interested in government and politics and that kind of leadership. And as I got to know churches when I was in college, traveling and speaking at different churches, I realized that there were some churches that had a lot of opportunity that were really starving for leadership. And I just felt like, boy, there's a real need there. And it's my passion. And so really, it was leadership, not so much teaching, that kind of drew me to ministry. And I was interested in building the church and building congregations and growing congregations. And over time, I began to become more and more interested in teaching Scripture and teaching Bible than just simply leading an organization. And so it was kind of that need. I saw the need for church leadership. And then once I got into ministry, I realized that so many churches in my particular tribe, the Presbyterian Church USA, were really declining. And that was something that was so obvious. And I felt like the first church I served, I saw where it grew and became healthy. And I was like, man, I really want to do this throughout my ministry. And so I just started looking for opportunities to go to places that had, first of all, great potential, but also were just needing to be kind of redeveloped and rejuvenated. And so I just saw that need. So that's kind of how I did it,
Oh, sounds good.
I guess. And then when I came here at this stage of my life in ministry, I wanted to try something different. And so this just seemed like such a unique opportunity to come here.
Yeah, it is. But every time you go somewhere new, you're building a new ministry,
try to.
right? You have to answer the needs of that specific congregation. And
Yep.
think we're doing that here.
I think so. I
Yeah.
think we are. What about you? What drew you to be in ministry?
Well, first it worked with my schedule,
Okay,
my
right.
schedule. But now I like being a liaison with the community, specifically our work with Brenda Cowan, which, I didn't start, but I loved being a part of, just making sure that those elementary kids' basic needs are met. And we're actually starting a new program with Mill Creek that I'm excited about. We'll tell our people soon, but just establishing relationships with
Yeah.
children in the community who might not otherwise
Mhm.
have that ability or even that opportunity. So I think that's been a huge thing
Yeah.
for me.
It seems like that's your calling.
I think it is. I think
Yeah.
with kids, with underprivileged kids, 'cause
Right.
it's like we were talking about Mary, and I know she's a bit older, but just that innocence and that purity, there's just nothing better.
Yeah. I love that image. I can't remember. I want to say it was a theologian named Frederick Buechner who said, your calling is where the world's great need is met by your passion, in that intersection between those two. And I think that's really important for especially younger people who are trying to figure it out, but throughout life, what needs to be done.
Oh, I'm just going to say out there for my generation, this is the fourth iteration of trying to figure it out. But it is funny how you always come back to the same thing. I always feel myself coming back to something related to children, whether it's just with my child or volunteerism.
Right. My dad had the same career his whole life. He was a college professor, and really the majority of his career in one place. Now, he had different roles within his profession, but that's what he did. And I was talking with my son last night. He was over, and we were just talking about his vocation. And I was saying, I was kind of like your grandfather. 35 years ago, started this thing, and I've had different settings, but the same job and the same boss, God, because he's at that point where he's thinking, am I going to stick with what I'm doing right now or try something else?
Yeah.
But I said, just make yourself open. Say, God, I'm your instrument. How can you use me?
I think it's a good thing. I used to be a little insecure about the fact that I had so many career transitions, but now I look back and go, I'm so lucky. I got to experience all those. I used to be
Absolutely.
art history, medical school, working at a church.
Right. And I think that there's a richness to that. Throughout my years as a pastor, I've thought, would I have benefited from doing something else for a while and seeing what the world's like out there in that marketplace?
Right.
And I've had to kind of rely on people in the church to educate me on that rather than me doing it myself.
But you have done some consulting with academic institutions, so I think you probably have some of it that way.
Oh gosh, it's fun. We've kind of gotten far away from the passage, but that's okay. But I was praying this morning and I just was opening myself to God. What are you trying to do here at Walnut Hill Church? What are you trying to do through me here and in other places that I serve? I'm just trying to be open to that. I was telling a friend of mine on the phone this morning, because I was in such a crabby mood because of our heat, which is a first world problem, I know.
But it is.
It was
I
cold.
mean, yeah, it's cold.
And I said, I kind of bled over the congregation a little bit, like, I've been doing this a long time. And what I was trying to say was, I always wonder and pray over, I wouldn't say I worry about, but am I doing a good job? Am I doing what the church needs? Am I serving the church well? When you walk into a place like Walnut Hill, your thought is, I want to do a good job for these folks. So I needed to see that garland party. For me, that was a sign from God. Now, in the passage, we had these two signs. The first sign is the virgin will conceive. And then the second sign was Gabriel said, hey, by the way, if you want some confirmation that God's doing something miraculous, Elizabeth's pregnant. And so God is a God who does give us signs and communicate with us. And so for me, Saturday, seeing that garland party and 40 people crammed into our little fellowship hall, and there's a fire in the fireplace and hot chocolate and cider and coffee and Christmas music and laughter and connection. That was a sign for me. That was confirmation. Hey, things are good.
It was. There was such a good spirit. And I mean, 40 people hand making garland all for our church gates. It's wonderful.
It was wonderful. So have you ever experienced a sign from God?
Ooh, I think that's a hard one because I feel like you don't necessarily know if it's a sign until afterwards. And then I always worry about interpreting correctly because there's some people you hear about who have had signs and you're going, that's not a sign.
Yeah.
That's like maybe something you need help with.
Yeah. And institutions are filled with people who have heard from God.
No, but I definitely have had like some lights flicker at some interesting times or just where I felt I was supposed to be there for someone during a really tough period in their life, or someone was supposed to be there for me.
Right.
So definitely signs that there's intentionality.
Yeah. One of our students yesterday was asking about signs I've experienced because he was in the service and listened to the sermon and said he's in a fellowship for Christian athletes, and someone in the FCA talks often about God told me to do this. And he's like, I've just never felt like God has told me to do something. And my response was just continue to walk close with God, pray, read God's word, and you might find yourself feeling strangely led.
But I love that honesty because we talked about this before when people talk about their conversion story. So many of us don't have that lightning bolt moment. And so it is kind of a Amy Cuddy, fake it till you make it. I think that can be powerful too. It's just really following the course and trusting that it'll work out, whether you see those very blatant signs or not.
There was an old theologian, a wonderful preacher named Peter Marshall, and he was a chaplain of the Senate. He was a Scot and a wonderful pulpiteer and just a saintly, godly, wonderful guy. And he had a conversion experience where he was walking when he was, I think he was a teenager, maybe around age 20, and he tripped and fell, and it was kind of foggy, and he realized that he had fallen just before walking over a cliff.
Wow.
And that was like his aha moment. And I remember reading that and thinking about his call to ministry and thinking, mine is not very exciting. God just kind of molded and nudged through the day-to-day and the voices of people around me.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how I heard from him.
Yeah, I think those kind of more mundane stories are a little easier for me just because I think that's been mine too. I don't think there has been a flash of lightning. It's just
Right.
continual seeking and learning.
Mm-hmm. Well, and even when Jesus called his disciples, I'm thinking about when he called Peter, for example. I mean, Peter was just doing his job. He's just, hey, I'll make you a fisher of people,
Mhm.
a fisher of men. He kind of met him where he was. It wasn't like he pulled him aside and put him on the side of a mountain and said, in a loud voice, here's what you're going to do. Just kind of reached him just sort of as he's going about his day to day. And that's always been helpful for me because you can feel like, man, I'm just sort of inferior here with my testimony or my story of God calling me.
Or if you feel like you're not being directly spoken to, you feel like,
Mhm.
what am I doing wrong? Am I praying wrong? He just speaks in different ways, I think.
Yeah. So we kind of hit some of our themes, Jesse. We hit the theme of, first of all, just kind of who Mary was, a little bit about Gabriel, the prophecy, then the idea of being an instrument, God giving us a sign. We didn't talk about her life being complicated. Is there anything about that? Or about life in general being complicated? Or is it just sort of stands on its own?
I think it stands on its own. I mean,
Uh-huh.
I've talked about that in sermons before, certainly that God doesn't promise us an easy road,
Mm-hmm.
but He's there with us.
Yep. I concluded, and I sort of tailed off at the end yesterday. Sometimes you do that. You look out and you see it's time to stop. It's time to stop teaching.
It's called reading the room.
You just do it. Yeah, I was like, all right. But here's how the passage ends. Elizabeth said to Mary, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the one you will bear. Blessed is she who has believed that what the Lord has said to her will be accomplished." And I connected, blessed is the one who believed. And the word blessing in the New Testament refers to receiving a gift from God that actually brings us closer to God and brings us great joy and meaning and peace and satisfaction. And I just love the concept that when we believe, we experience blessedness.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm looking forward to next week. I've already got some questions.
Well, you're going to have to wait 2 weeks.
Oh, that's right, because we have our Christmas pageant. All right, well,
Mhm.
I will be ready and armed.
All right, to the 21st?
Yes,
All right.
absolutely.
Good deal. Anything else for
Oh,
the good of the group?
that's it. Just everyone continue and enjoying Advent season, and we're looking forward to this weekend with everyone.
Fantastic. Have a wonderful week. You take good care. And thank you, Jesse, for leading us off today.
Yeah, do I say bye for now? Bye for now.
Thanks so much for listening. We hope you'll join us again on December 22nd as we pick up our Advent series and move one step closer to Christmas. Until then, may the season fill your heart with hope and anticipation as we look forward to the coming of Christ.